The crystal chandelier reflected off polished marble as Marcus Aldridge leaned back in his leather chair, speaking rapid Arabic to his business partners across the mahogany conference table. His voice carried the casual arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. The 5 men laughed at his words, their eyes occasionally flickering toward the young woman refilling their water glasses. She moved quietly, almost invisibly, in her simple black uniform and worn shoes. Marcus gestured dismissively in her direction as he continued speaking, his Arabic flowing smoothly, confidently. What he didn't notice was the way her hand trembled slightly as she set down the crystal pitcher. What he couldn't see was the single tear that traced down her cheek before she blinked it away. Before I tell you what she understood, answer this honestly. Have you ever witnessed someone being cruel simply because they thought no one would know? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Marcus Aldridge hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by being kind. He'd built it by being ruthless, calculating, and always 3 steps ahead. The waterfront restaurant he chose for this meeting cost more per plate than most people earned in a week, and he liked it that way. It reminded everyone in the room exactly who held the power. His Arabic was flawless, perfected during years of oil negotiations in Dubai and Riyadh. It was his secret weapon, the language he used when he wanted to say things in plain sight that Americans wouldn't understand. "She reminds me of a donkey," he said in Arabic, not even lowering his voice. "Useful for carrying things, but too stupid to matter." His partners chuckled uncomfortably. One of them, a younger man named Khalid, glanced at the waitress, but Marcus waved him off. "Please, she doesn't understand. Look at her. Another American who probably thinks Arabic and Spanish are the same thing." The waitress, her name tag read Sarah, continued her work with steady hands. She moved to clear empty glasses, her movements practiced and efficient. But inside, each word landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples that spread through her entire being. Because Sarah did understand every single word. She'd learned Arabic from her grandmother, who'd fled Lebanon during the Civil War with nothing but her children and her faith. Sarah had spent countless afternoons in that tiny kitchen in Detroit, rolling grape leaves while her grandmother taught her the language of their ancestors. She'd studied it formally, too, earned a degree in Middle Eastern studies from a university she'd paid for with 3 jobs and student loans that still crushed her monthly budget. She dreamed of being a translator, of bridging cultures, of mattering. But life had other plans. Her mother's cancer came fast and vicious. The medical bills piled up faster than Sarah could count. Her dreams got packed away in the same boxes as her diploma. Now she served water to men who saw her as furniture. Marcus continued, emboldened by what he perceived as privacy. "You know what I love about America?" he said in Arabic, reaching for his wine glass. "The poor people here are so convinced they might be rich someday that they defend us, they protect us. It's beautiful, really." He took a long sip, savoring both the vintage and his own cleverness. "This one probably votes to lower my taxes while she can't afford her own health care." Sarah's jaw tightened, but her face remained neutral. Years of service industry work had taught her to smile through anything. She'd smiled through harassment, through insults, through customers snapping their fingers at her like she was a dog. She'd smiled because she needed this job, because her mother's medication cost $1,800 a month, because the landlord didn't care about her dignity, only her rent check. But something was different today. Maybe it was the way Marcus had compared her to a donkey. Maybe it was the calloused laughter of men who'd never known what it meant to choose between medicine and groceries. Or maybe it was simply that she'd reached the invisible line, the point where silence becomes complicit. She finished clearing the table and quietly left the room. The men barely noticed her absence. They were too busy celebrating the deal they were about to close, a deal that would make Marcus another $100 million while putting 3,000 factory workers out of jobs. The details didn't matter to them. Numbers on a spreadsheet weren't people. They were just calculations. 10 minutes later, Sarah returned, but she wasn't carrying a water pitcher. In her hand was a single photograph, worn at the edges from being touched too many times. She approached the table and stood directly beside Marcus, close enough that he finally had to acknowledge her presence. He looked up with irritation, ready to dismiss her, but something in her eyes made him pause. "Excuse me, sir," she said in English, her voice steady but soft. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." She placed the photograph on the table in front of him. It showed a young woman in graduation robes, beaming with pride, holding a diploma. Standing beside her was an elderly woman in a hijab, tears streaming down her face. "That's me," Sarah continued, still in English, "and that's my grandmother, Amira. She taught me Arabic when I was 5 years old." The color drained from Marcus's face. The room went completely silent except for the soft clink of ice in someone's glass. Khalid closed his eyes, already knowing what was coming. The other men exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly finding their phones very interesting. Sarah switched seamlessly to Arabic, her accent carrying the musical rhythm of Lebanese dialect. "My grandmother used to tell me that language is a gift, that it allows us to truly see each other, to understand each other's humanity." Her voice didn't waver. "She also taught me that how we speak about others when we think they can't understand us reveals who we truly are." Marcus tried to find words, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in shallow water. His carefully constructed power was crumbling because he'd made the oldest mistake in the book. He'd assumed. He'd looked at her uniform, her worn shoes, her quiet demeanor, and decided she was less than him. He'd created a story about who she was without knowing a single true thing about her. "I have a degree in Middle Eastern studies," Sarah continued in Arabic, each word precise and clear. "I graduated summa cum laude. I was offered a position at the State Department." She paused, letting that sink in. "But my mother got sick, stage 4 cancer. I came home to take care of her because that's what family does. And now I work 3 jobs to pay for her medication, which costs more than your wine probably cost tonight." She picked up the photograph, her fingers gentle on its edges. "My grandmother was right about language. It is a gift, but it's also a responsibility. Because once you understand someone's words, you can't pretend you don't know their heart." She looked directly at Marcus. "You called me a donkey. You mocked my intelligence. You made assumptions about my beliefs, my life, my worth. And you did it because you thought you were safe. You thought I was invisible." Marcus finally found his voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. I "That's not an excuse," Sarah interrupted, still speaking Arabic. "You didn't need to know my story to treat me like a human being. You just needed to see me as one." The silence that followed was suffocating. Khalid was the first to move, standing slowly and reaching into his wallet. He pulled out several bills and handed them to Sarah. "I'm sorry," he said in Arabic. "We all should have said something. I should have said something." Sarah nodded at him, accepting the gesture not for the money, but for the acknowledgement. She turned to leave, but Marcus's voice stopped her. This time he too spoke in Arabic. "Wait." He stood, his confident posture gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. His hand shook slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. "I want to—" He pulled out his business card, but Sarah raised her hand. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "I don't want your business card, or your guilty conscience, or your sudden charity." She met his eyes one final time. "I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that every person you dismiss, every person you insult when you think they can't hear you, has a story, has a grandmother who loved them, has dreams they had to bury, has dignity that doesn't depend on your recognition." She walked toward the door, but before leaving, she turned back and spoke in English, her voice carrying clearly across the elegant room. "By the way, the word you used, himar, it doesn't just mean donkey. It also means someone who carries burdens for others. My grandmother taught me that too. She said the prophets were often called that because they carried the weight of truth. A small, sad smile crossed her face. Funny how the same word can be an insult or an honor, depending on who's speaking. The door closed softly behind her. The 5 men sat in stunned silence, the remains of their expensive meal suddenly looking obscene. The deal they'd been celebrating felt hollow. Marcus stared at the space where Sarah had stood, his mind replaying every word he'd said, every assumption he'd made. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus Aldridge felt small. 3 days later, the local news reported that an anonymous donor had paid off the medical debt of 50 families in the city. The donation came with one condition, that each family receive a handwritten note saying simply, "You are seen, you matter." Marcus never told anyone that he'd gone back to the restaurant looking for Sarah, only to learn she'd quit. He never told anyone that he'd spent hours trying to find her, to apologize properly, to somehow make amends. He never told anyone that her words haunted his dreams. But he did tell his sons years later, when they were old enough to understand. He told them about the waitress who spoke Arabic and how she taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. "Your grandmother used to say that God tests us when we think no one is watching," he'd tell them. "That day I failed the test, but she taught me that failure isn't the end. It's only the end if you don't learn from it." The photograph of Sarah and her grandmother remained in his desk drawer until the day he died, a reminder that language might be a tool, but humanity is a choice. And some lessons, the ones that truly change us, come from the people we never expected to teach us anything at all. Because in the end, the most powerful words aren't the ones we speak in secret. They're the ones that reveal who we are when we think no one understands. And sometimes, the person you underestimate is exactly the one who will make you finally see yourself.